I should have never looked under that bed because the moment I did, something in my life shifted in a way I still cannot fully explain. And the worst part is I cannot even tell if I was wrong or if I was right all along. It started on a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind where the house feels almost too still, like it is holding its breath, and I had decided to finally clean out the guest bedroom upstairs, the one Emily had been using for the past few weeks whenever she stayed over, which was happening more often lately, something I had noticed but never questioned out loud, because I have always believed that keeping the peace in a family matters more than chasing every small discomfort. The room itself looked perfectly normal at first glance, the bed neatly made, the curtains half open letting in a soft strip of sunlight, and her suitcase tucked in the corner exactly where she always left it, but there was this faint feeling I could not quite name, like walking into a place where a conversation had just ended before you arrived. I remember telling myself I was being silly, that I was reading too much into nothing, and I even laughed a little under my breath as I started straightening the sheets and fluffing the pillows, trying to shake off that uneasy thought. It was not until I bent down to pick up something small near the nightstand that I noticed how dark it was under the bed, darker than it should have been, as if something was blocking the light, and for a second I hesitated, which now feels ridiculous, because what could possibly be under a bed besides dust and maybe a stray sock? Still, I got down on my knees and leaned forward, brushing my hand along the floor before finally reaching a little deeper, and that is when my fingers touched something soft but oddly firm. Something that did not belong there. I pulled it out slowly, not even thinking, just reacting, and when it came into the light, I felt this strange tightening in my chest that I could not immediately explain. It was a small doll, handmade by the look of it, with rough stitching and simple fabric, the kind you might find at a craft fair or tucked away in a drawer somewhere. And at first I almost smiled because it seemed harmless, even a little childish, but then I noticed the tag pinned to its chest, a small piece of paper folded over itself, and for some reason my hand suddenly felt heavier as I reached to open it. I remember telling myself it was probably nothing, maybe a label from a store or a child's note, but when I unfolded it and saw my own name written there, Margaret Collins, in careful, deliberate handwriting, the room seemed to shrink around me in a way that made it hard to breathe for just a moment. I did not scream or drop the doll like you might expect. I just sat there on the floor, holding it, staring at it, trying to make sense of something that did not fit into any normal explanation I could come up with, and the first thought that crossed my mind was not fear but confusion, followed closely by a quiet, creeping question that I did not want to ask but could not ignore. Why was this here, and more importantly, why did it have my name on it? I placed the doll on the bed and stood up slowly, brushing off my knees as if that simple motion could somehow ground me back in reality, and I tried to think logically, tried to walk myself through every possible explanation that did not involve anything strange or unsettling, because that is what I have always done. I look for the reasonable answer first. I give people the benefit of the doubt, especially when it comes to family. Emily had been the only one staying in this room, that much was certain, but that did not mean anything on its own, not yet, and I told myself there had to be a simple explanation, something ordinary that I was just not seeing yet. Maybe it was part of a gift or some kind of craft project, or even a joke that had gone too far without anyone realizing how it might look. Still, as I stood there in that quiet room with the afternoon light slowly shifting across the floor, I could not shake the feeling that something about this was not accidental, not forgotten, not harmless, and for the first time in a long while, I found myself wondering if I had been overlooking more than just small discomforts in this house. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the doll resting on the neatly made bed, trying to convince myself that placing it there had somehow made the situation more normal, more understandable, but the longer I looked at it, the more out of place it seemed, like it did not belong in this house or anywhere near me, and yet it had been hidden in a room that was now tied closely to someone I had welcomed into my family without hesitation. I reached out again, almost against my better judgment, and picked it up a second time, turning it slowly in my hands, studying the stitching, the fabric, the way the tag had been attached so carefully, not loosely or carelessly, but with intention, as if whoever made it wanted that name to stay exactly where it was. I tried to laugh again, to shake off the growing weight in my chest, telling myself that I was letting my imagination run too far, that there had to be a reasonable explanation that I simply had not seen yet, and I even said it out loud just to hear how it sounded, as if hearing my own voice would make it true. It is probably nothing, I said, just something silly, something harmless, but the words did not settle the way they usually did, and instead they seemed to echo back at me with a hollow feeling that made the room feel even quieter than before. I placed the doll back on the bed, this time a little farther away from me, and walked toward the window, looking out at the driveway where nothing had changed, where the world outside still looked exactly the same as it had before I knelt down and reached under that bed. And for a moment I wished I had never decided to clean that room at all. My eyes drifted back toward Emily's suitcase in the corner, and I found myself staring at it longer than I should have, not because I intended to go through it, but because it suddenly felt like it held answers I was not ready to face. I have always believed in respecting boundaries, especially in my own home, and I would never go through someone else's belongings without a clear reason, but now I was not sure what counted as a clear reason anymore. I turned away from it and took a slow breath, reminding myself that jumping to conclusions would only make things worse, that I needed to stay calm, to stay rational, because once you start seeing things through suspicion, everything begins to look suspicious whether it is or not. Still, as I stepped out of the room and gently closed the door behind me, I could not ignore the quiet shift that had taken place inside my mind, a shift that made me more aware of every small detail, every sound in the house, every memory of the past few weeks that now felt slightly different when I replayed it. I thought about the way Emily had been staying over more frequently, how she had insisted on using that particular room even though we had another guest room downstairs, how she sometimes seemed perfectly warm and friendly and then distant in ways I could not quite explain, and I began to question whether those moments had always been there or if I was only noticing them now because of what I had found. I went into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady but my thoughts anything but, and I stood there by the counter trying to decide what to do next, because doing nothing did not feel right anymore, but doing something felt even riskier without knowing the full truth. I told myself that the best thing I could do was wait, observe and listen, to give this situation time to reveal itself in a way that made sense, because confronting someone without understanding could damage something that might not even be broken. But as I took a sip of water and set the glass down, I realized that whether I wanted it or not, I had already crossed the line the moment I picked up that doll and read my name, and there was no simple way to step back to where things had been before. The rest of that afternoon passed in a way that felt almost unreal, like I was moving through familiar spaces but with a new layer of awareness I could not turn off, and every small detail seemed sharper, louder, more significant than it had been before. Even the ticking of the clock in the hallway felt different, as if it was marking time toward something I did not yet understand. I tried to continue with my routine, wiping down the kitchen counters, folding a set of clean towels, straightening a stack of mail that had already been sorted twice, but none of it held my attention for more than a few seconds because my mind kept drifting back upstairs, back to that room, back to the image of that small doll resting on the bed with my name attached to it in a way that felt far too deliberate to ignore. I told myself again that I needed to stay calm, that I needed to observe before reacting, and that meant paying attention not just to what I had found, but to the person I believed might be connected to it, even if I was not ready to say that out loud yet. Emily was expected to arrive later that evening, and the thought of seeing her now carried a different weight than it ever had before, not fear exactly, but a heightened sense of awareness that made me question how much I truly knew about someone I had welcomed into my home without hesitation. When the sound of a car pulling into the driveway finally reached me, I felt my posture straighten instinctively, as if my body had decided before my mind that this moment mattered more than the others, and I walked toward the front door at a measured pace, reminding myself that nothing had been proven, nothing had been confirmed, and that I needed to act as I always had, at least on the surface. The door opened and Emily stepped inside with that same easy smile she always wore, greeting me warmly, asking how my day had been, her tone light and familiar, and for a brief second I almost convinced myself that everything was exactly as it had always been, that I had imagined the tension, that I had overreacted to something harmless, but then I noticed the way her eyes moved past me toward the staircase for just a fraction of a second before returning to meet mine, and it was such a small detail that I might have missed it on any other day but not today. I responded the way I always did, keeping my voice steady, asking about her drive, offering to make her something to eat, and she declined politely, saying she was not hungry, that she might head upstairs to rest for a bit. And that was when I felt that quiet shift again, the one that made every word carry more meaning than it should. I nodded, stepping aside to let her pass, and as she walked toward the stairs, I watched her more carefully than I ever had before, noticing the rhythm of her steps, the way she held onto the railing briefly, the pause at the top of the stairs that lasted just long enough to suggest she was thinking about something before continuing down the hall toward the guest room. I remained where I was, listening as the door upstairs opened and then closed, and for a moment I considered following her immediately, confronting the situation before it had time to grow into something larger, but that instinct was quickly replaced by a more cautious thought, one that reminded me that I still did not understand what I was dealing with, and that acting too quickly could lead me down a path I could not easily undo. Instead, I moved quietly toward the base of the stairs, standing there just long enough to hear the faint sounds coming from above, the soft movement of fabric, the shifting of objects, and then silence again, a silence that felt heavier now that I was listening for it. I told myself that I needed more information, something beyond a single object and a feeling, something that would either confirm my concerns or allow me to put them to rest once and for all, but as I stood there, I realized that even if I found that information, it might not bring the clarity I was hoping for, because some answers have a way of complicating things more than they resolve them, and deep down, I was beginning to sense that whatever this was, it was not going to be as simple as I wanted it to be. I did not go upstairs right away, even though every instinct in me was pulling me in that direction, because I knew that whatever I chose to do next needed to be intentional, not reactive, and that meant giving myself just enough time to think clearly without letting the situation spiral into something driven by fear or assumption. So I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to busy myself with small, meaningless tasks while my attention remained fixed on the faint sounds coming from above. A few minutes passed, maybe 10, though it felt longer, and then I heard the soft creak of the guest room door opening again, followed by footsteps moving across the hallway, steady and unhurried, and I stepped back slightly so that when Emily came down the stairs, it would appear as though I had simply been passing through rather than waiting, because the last thing I wanted was for her to feel watched before I understood what I was dealing with. She walked into the kitchen with that same calm expression, her movements relaxed, almost too relaxed, and she reached for a glass as if everything in the world was exactly as it should be, asking me casually if I had seen her phone charger, saying she thought she might have left it somewhere downstairs earlier, and the normalcy of the question caught me off guard for just a second, because it did not match the tension that had been building in my mind. I told her I had not seen it, keeping my tone even, and then I added, almost without thinking, that I had been cleaning the guest room earlier, watching carefully for any reaction, any shift in her expression that might confirm or dismiss the growing suspicion I was trying so hard to keep under control. Somewhere else, and it was in that small detail that I felt my earlier doubts begin to solidify into something more defined, something that no longer felt like imagination. I excused myself after a moment, saying I needed to check on something upstairs, and I walked past her without rushing, feeling her presence behind me in a way that made the air seem heavier with each step I took toward the staircase. As I made my way up, I could not ignore the fact that this was the first time I had ever felt uncertain in my own home, the first time I had questioned not just a situation, but a person I had trusted without reservation, and that realization settled into me with a quiet weight that made each step feel more deliberate than the last. When I reached the top of the stairs, I paused just outside the guest room door, my hand hovering near the handle, listening for any movement inside. But there was nothing, only silence, the same kind of silence that had greeted me earlier, and I knew that whatever I was about to do next would either bring clarity or deepen the uncertainty I was already carrying. I opened the door slowly and stepped inside, my eyes moving immediately to the bed where I had left the doll, and for a split second, I felt a strange sense of relief when I saw that it was still there, exactly where I had placed it, untouched, unchanged, as if confirming that at least one part of this situation remained stable. But that feeling did not last long, because the more I looked around the room, the more I began to notice subtle differences, small shifts that suggested I was no longer the only one who had been paying attention. At first, I could not explain what felt different, because nothing in the room appeared obviously disturbed. The bed was still neatly made, the curtains hung exactly where they had been, and the suitcase remained in the corner just as before, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, something almost invisible yet undeniable, like walking into a place where someone had been standing just seconds earlier, and left behind a trace you could not quite see but could somehow sense. I stepped further inside, closing the door quietly behind me and let my eyes move slowly across each surface, not searching for anything specific but allowing my attention to settle on the smallest details, the kind that usually go unnoticed unless you are looking for them with intention. The doll was still on the bed, positioned exactly where I had placed it, but now that I was seeing it again after speaking with Emily, it no longer felt like an isolated discovery, it felt connected, like a piece of something larger that I was only beginning to understand. I moved closer to the bed and reached out, picking it up once more, and as I held it in my hands, I noticed something I had not seen earlier, a faint crease along the tag where my name was written, as if it had been opened and closed more than once, not just by me, and that small detail sent a quiet ripple of unease through me that I could not ignore. I turned the doll slightly, examining the stitching again, the way the fabric had been folded and secured, and I began to wonder not just why it existed, but how long it had been here, how many times it had been handled, and whether I had simply never noticed the signs before. I placed it back down carefully, exactly where it had been, and stepped back, taking in the entire room again, this time with a sharper focus, and that was when I saw it, not something large or obvious, but something small enough that it could have easily been overlooked, a slight indentation on the carpet near the side of the bed, as if something had been placed there recently and then moved. I crouched down, running my hand lightly over the area, feeling the fibers shift beneath my fingers, and I tried to recall whether that indentation had been there earlier when I first entered the room, but I could not be certain, which only added to the growing sense that I was piecing together something incomplete. I stood up again and turned toward the nightstand, opening the drawer slowly, not with the intention of invading privacy, but with the need to understand whether what I had found was part of something larger, and inside I saw only a few ordinary items, a book, a small notepad, a pen, nothing that immediately stood out, but even their placement felt slightly too deliberate, too orderly, as if everything in this room had been arranged with purpose rather than convenience. I closed the drawer and stepped back, taking a slow breath, trying to steady my thoughts, because I could feel them beginning to move faster than I wanted, connecting details in ways that might not be fair or accurate, and I reminded myself again that suspicion can reshape reality if you let it, turning ordinary things into something they are not. Still, as I moved toward the door, preparing to leave the room once more, I paused, my hand resting lightly on the handle, and I found myself glancing back one last time at the bed, at the doll, at the quiet stillness that now felt anything but neutral, and I realized that whatever this was, it was no longer something I could simply observe from a distance, because each moment I spent trying to stay neutral was slowly being replaced by a growing need to understand the truth, even if that truth might change the way I saw everything that had come before. I closed the door behind me with a careful, controlled motion, as if even the sound of the latch clicking into place needed to be measured, and as I stepped back into the hallway, I realized that the quiet I had once found comforting in this house now felt different, heavier, like it was holding on to something that had not yet been said out loud. I did not go back downstairs immediately, instead I lingered at the top of the stairs for a moment, listening again, not just for movement, but for anything that might give me a clearer sense of what I was dealing with, but there was nothing, only the distant hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock below, ordinary sounds that now felt strangely disconnected from everything unfolding around them. I took a slow breath and finally made my way down, keeping my steps even, my posture steady, reminding myself that whatever I was feeling needed to stay contained, at least until I had something more concrete than intuition and fragments. When I reached the bottom, Emily was still in the kitchen, standing by the counter, her glass now half empty, and she looked up as I entered, with that same calm expression, as if the entire house existed on a different level for her, one where nothing had shifted at all. She asked if everything upstairs was all set, her tone light, almost routine, and for a brief moment I considered answering honestly, considered saying that something did not feel right, that I had questions I could not ignore, but instead I nodded, keeping my response simple, telling her that everything was fine, because I could sense that this was not the moment for confrontation, not yet. She smiled again, but this time I noticed how quickly it faded, how it seemed to serve a purpose more than reflect a feeling, and I found myself watching her more closely than ever, not in a way that was obvious, but in a way that allowed me to pick up on the smallest shifts, the kind that only reveal themselves when you are no longer taking things at face value. We exchanged a few more words, nothing significant, just the kind of conversation people have to fill space, and then she mentioned that she might step out for a bit to run a quick errand, saying she needed to pick something up from a nearby store. And while that would not have stood out to me before, now it felt like an opportunity, one that I had not planned for but could not ignore. I told her that was fine, that I would be here if she needed anything, and I kept my tone neutral, even as my mind began to move ahead, considering what I could do with the time I would have once she left. When I heard the front door close a few minutes later, followed by the sound of her car pulling away, I waited, not rushing, giving it enough time to be certain she would not return unexpectedly, and then I moved, not with panic, but with purpose, heading back toward the stairs with a clarity that had been building steadily beneath the surface. As I climbed, I felt a shift within myself, not fear but a quiet determination that had replaced it, because at some point the need to understand becomes stronger than the desire to remain comfortable, and I knew that I had reached that point. I entered the guest room again, this time without hesitation, and my attention went immediately to the areas I had not fully explored before, the spaces that might hold answers if I was willing to look closely enough, and I found myself drawn back to the nightstand, to the drawer I had opened only briefly, because something about it had felt too controlled, too intentional to be dismissed as ordinary. I opened it again, this time taking a moment to examine each item more carefully, the book, the notepad, the pen, and as I lifted the notepad, I noticed a slight difference in weight, something that suggested there might be more to it than what was visible on the surface, and as I flipped it open slowly, deliberately, I felt that same tightening in my chest return, not because I knew what I would find, but because I had a growing sense that whatever was hidden here had been placed with purpose, and that purpose was no longer something I could afford to ignore. I flipped through the first few pages slowly, expecting to see nothing more than blank paper or casual notes, but what I found instead made me pause in a way that felt far deeper than surprise, because the pages were not empty, they were filled, not with long entries or detailed writing, but with short lines, repeated phrases, and small, careful handwriting that seemed too deliberate to be random. And at first I could not even process what I was looking at, because my mind resisted the idea that any of it meant something connected to me. I turned another page, then another, and the same pattern continued, lines written with consistency, each one slightly different but carrying a tone that felt focused, intentional, almost rehearsed, and I began to notice how often my name appeared, not in every line, but enough that it could not be dismissed as coincidence. And that realization settled into me slowly, like a quiet pressure building rather than a sudden shock. I read one line again, then another, trying to understand the context, searching for a logical explanation that would place these words into something ordinary, something harmless, but the more I read, the harder it became to separate what I was seeing from the growing sense that this had been written with purpose, not casually, not accidentally, but as part of something structured, something repeated over time. I closed the notepad halfway and rested my hand on top of it, taking a breath, because I could feel my thoughts beginning to move faster than I wanted them to, connecting details that might not yet be fully understood, and I reminded myself again that interpretation without context can lead to conclusions that are not fair or accurate, but even with that reminder, I could not ignore what was in front of me. I opened the notepad again, this time more carefully, and flipped toward the back, where the pages felt slightly more worn, as if they had been revisited more often, and there I found something that shifted the situation in a way that made it impossible to return to the comfort of uncertainty. Tucked between two pages was a small folded piece of paper, separate from the rest, not attached, not part of the notebook itself, and as I pulled it out, I noticed how precisely it had been folded, the edges aligned in a way that suggested care rather than convenience, and for a moment I simply held it there, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make, because opening it meant stepping further into something I could not easily step back from. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing it out with my fingers, and what I saw was not long or complicated, but it was clear enough to remove any remaining doubt that this was something casual or meaningless, because the words were direct, written in the same careful handwriting, and they referenced moments, small interactions, things that had happened in this house, details that only someone present would know. And woven into those lines was a tone that felt controlled, measured, almost as if each word had been chosen with intention rather than emotion. I read through it once, then again, trying to understand not just what was written, but why it had been written this way, why it had been hidden here, and why it connected so directly to me. And as I stood there in that quiet room, holding that folded piece of paper in my hand, I realized that the situation had moved beyond suspicion into something far more defined, something that required a response even if I did not yet know what that response should be. I carefully folded the paper back along its original lines and placed it exactly where I had found it, returning the notepad to the drawer with the same level of precision, because I understood now that whatever this was, it had been arranged with intention, and disturbing that arrangement too much could reveal that I had seen what I was not meant to see. As I closed the drawer and stepped back, I felt a shift inside myself, not panic, not fear, but a clarity that had not been there before. Because while I still did not fully understand the meaning behind everything I had found, I could no longer pretend that it was harmless or accidental, and for the first time since this began, I found myself preparing not just to observe but to act, knowing that whatever came next would change the dynamic of this house in a way that could not be undone. I closed the drawer slowly and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me again. But this time it did not feel empty. It felt filled with everything I had just seen, everything I could not unsee, and the difference between not knowing and knowing even partially was far greater than I had expected, because it did not bring clarity the way I had hoped. It brought a deeper awareness that made every thought feel heavier and every decision more deliberate. I walked out of the room with the same careful control I had used before, making sure nothing looked disturbed, nothing out of place, and as I stepped into the hallway, I realized that I was no longer trying to convince myself that this was nothing. I had moved past that stage without even noticing, and now I was standing somewhere in between understanding and uncertainty, where the facts existed but their meaning was still just out of reach. I made my way downstairs again, slower this time, my mind replaying what I had read, the repeated lines, the references to moments that had seemed ordinary at the time but now carried a different weight, and I found myself questioning not just those moments, but my own role in them, wondering if I had missed something important, something that might explain why my name had been written so many times with such careful intention. When I reached the kitchen, I paused by the counter, placing my hand lightly against the surface as if grounding myself, and I looked around the space that had always felt like the center of this home, the place where conversations happened, where routines were built, where trust was assumed rather than questioned, and I realized how quickly that sense of certainty could shift when something unexpected introduced doubt into it. I glanced toward the front window, half expecting to see Emily's car returning already, but the driveway remained empty, and that gave me a small window of time to decide what I would do next, not just in terms of actions, but in terms of how I would approach whatever came next with her. Confrontation felt inevitable now, but the way it happened would determine everything that followed, because once something like this is brought into the open, it cannot be taken back, and I needed to be certain that I understood enough before I crossed that line. I poured myself another glass of water, more out of habit than need, and as I stood there, I began to notice something that had been sitting just beneath the surface of everything I had seen, something I had not fully acknowledged until that moment. And that was the tone of the writing itself, not aggressive, not chaotic, but controlled, almost methodical, as if it had been created with focus rather than emotion, and that detail shifted my perspective in a subtle but important way, because it suggested that whatever this was, it was not impulsive, it was intentional in a way that required planning and repetition. I set the glass down and took a slow breath, letting that thought settle, because it changed the nature of what I was dealing with. It moved it away from something random or temporary, and into something that had been building over time, something that had existed in this house without my awareness until now. As I turned away from the counter, I heard the distant sound of a car approaching, and my attention shifted immediately toward the front of the house, my posture straightening again as I recognized the familiar sound of tires slowing in the driveway, and in that moment I understood that whatever I had been preparing for was no longer something in the future. It was here, arriving whether I was ready or not, and as I walked toward the front door, I could feel that quiet determination return, stronger now, clearer, because while I still did not have every answer, I knew enough to begin asking the right questions, and that was something I could no longer avoid. I opened the front door just as Emily reached the steps, and for a moment we simply looked at each other, her expression calm, composed, almost exactly as it had been earlier, and I realized in that instant that whatever was happening beneath the surface, she had already decided how she was going to present herself, and that meant I needed to be just as deliberate in how I responded. She greeted me with a small smile, stepping inside and brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she mentioned the errand she had run, something ordinary, something that would have felt completely natural just hours ago, and I nodded, stepping aside to let her pass, but this time I did not move away completely. I stayed just close enough to signal that I was not simply going to return to routine. She seemed to notice that immediately, her movement slowing just slightly as she turned back toward me, her expression shifting in a way that suggested she understood something had changed, even if neither of us had said it out loud yet. I took a breath, not to calm myself but to steady the moment, because I knew that once I spoke, there would be no returning to the silence that had existed before, and I told her that I needed to ask her something, keeping my voice even, controlled, not accusatory, but clear enough that it could not be dismissed as casual conversation. She held my gaze, waiting, her posture relaxed but attentive, and I could see that same measured awareness in her eyes that I had begun to recognize, the kind that does not react quickly because it is already considering the outcome. I told her that I had been upstairs again, that I had looked more closely at the room, and I watched carefully for any reaction, any shift that might reveal more than her words would, and this time the change was there, subtle but undeniable, a slight tightening around her eyes, a pause that lasted just long enough to confirm that what I was saying mattered. I continued, choosing my words with care, explaining that I had found something that did not make sense to me, something that seemed intentional, and I asked her directly if there was anything she wanted to tell me about it before I said more, giving her the space to respond, to explain, to correct, because despite everything I had seen, I still wanted to believe there was a version of this that could be understood without conflict. For a moment she said nothing, her eyes steady on mine, her expression unreadable in a way that felt practiced rather than uncertain, and then she exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing as if she had reached a decision, and when she spoke, her tone was calm, almost reassuring, but there was a weight behind it that made every word feel deliberate. She asked me what exactly I had found, not in a defensive way, but in a way that suggested she was measuring how much I knew before choosing how to respond, and that question alone told me more than I had expected, because it confirmed that there was something to know, something she had not already dismissed as irrelevant. I answered honestly, telling her about the doll, about the notepad, about the folded paper, not rushing through it, not exaggerating, just laying out the facts as I had seen them, and as I spoke, I watched her carefully, noticing how she did not interrupt, how she did not immediately deny or explain, but instead listened with a level of focus that suggested she had been anticipating this moment in some way. When I finished, the space between us felt different, not tense in the way I had imagined, but defined, as if a boundary had been drawn that neither of us could ignore, and for a brief second I wondered if I had misjudged everything, if perhaps there was an explanation that would make this all seem smaller than it felt, but that thought faded as soon as she began to speak again, because the look in her eyes had changed in a way that made it clear that whatever came next would not return things to how they had been, but would instead reveal a truth that had been waiting beneath the surface far longer than I had realized.